We are on a little lecture circuit in the build-up to our trial in February, trying to raise as much awareness as possible and trying to essentially travel the country as much as possible before that right possibly becomes taken away, as we both face a number of years in federal prison. For me, it all started on May 26th of 2004. It was 4:30 in the morning, and my phone wouldn't stop ringing. Now, with anybody that gets a phone call at 4:30 in the morning, you know it's never good news. It's not calling, it's not your buddy calling to say, hey, how you doing? I care about you. It's always bad. In this circumstance, it was no different. I was getting a call from somebody out in New York City. She said, Kevin, at 6 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Andy, out on Long Island, was arrested by hordes of FBI agents. He was charged with the violations of the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. She said his mother just called me about 10 minutes ago, and she said she saw other names on that arrest warrant. Myself and my two other roommates had been involved with a campaign that our friend Andy out in Long Island, New York, had been involved with. And over the last 2 years, we had seen an increase in FBI attention towards our little animal rights effort, and rightly presumed that our names may well be on that indictment. So at 4:30 in the morning, we got up, I put on court clothes, I shaved, I brushed my teeth, and I went and I stared out our front window in our Northern California home in the minutes leading up to 6 a.m. And at 6 a.m. Pacific time, I watched as 15 agents from the FBI, the ATF, the Secret Service, and the U.S. Air Marshals came charging at my front door with semi-automatic weapons and pistols. One guy was even wearing a balaclava and had a battering ram. Now, I'm fortunate enough to share my home and my life with two special little dogs. I've got a fat 11-year-old beagle named Willie, who's still asleep. He didn't get up. But I also have a 4-year-old Shepherd Retriever mix named Buddy, who, when the FBI started banging on the door as hard as they could, went crazy. So I went towards the door, I put my hand on the handle, and I said, give me a minute to control my dogs. They demanded I open the door immediately. So with one hand, I held Buddy by the collar, with the other I opened the door. And it was like it was a movie. Time truly stood still. All I remember of that arrest was that everything went silent. I remember the sheen of a pistol just inches from my face, staring down at it. And all I could hear was my own deafening heartbeat just racing. But reality quickly slapped me back into the present, when I realized Buddy had 4 guns pointed at me, and one belligerent officer was screaming, I'm going to shoot your dog! Thanks to a more composed roommate, Buddy and Willie's lives were spared that morning. But mine, my 2 roommates, Josh, and a few of our other friends across the country, were just starting their most trying period. The arrest lasted 15 minutes. By 6:15, I was in a car driving to the Oakland Federal Detention Building. A helicopter was over our home the whole time, and while we were in transit to the federal building, I heard the agent in the front seat authorizing the release of their press statement and their press release. Coordinated at the same time, the animal testing company Josh and I and Andy and my roommates had been protesting issued a press release as well, celebrating our arrest and our indictment. Within 2.5 hours of my arrest, I was released, having paid no bail, and I was being charged with terrorism. Now, when the FBI came to my house, and they came with the semi-automatic weapons, the pistols, the helicopter, the battering ram, and the balaclavas, they weren't coming because they thought Jake and Lauren and I were a threat to them, or we were going to be hard to capture. They'd been warrant, where 18 agents spent 9 hours taking everything that wasn't nailed down, from our bullhorn to anti-animal testing banners and leaflets, our computers, family photo albums. And poor Lauren, she had her videotape collection containing that popular 1970s sitcom Booze and Buddies confiscated as criminal evidence. When they came that morning, they knew we posed no threat to them. What, we're going to assault them with a floppy drive? Would Willie sniff their pant legs? The guns, the helicopter, the battering ram, the press release was not meant for me. It was meant for every one of you that dares sit in this audience tonight. Everybody that's a political activist that would open the newspaper the next day, because the message was clear. Look at what we will do to you if you get too loud, if you get too passionate, and God forbid you become too effective. What's your breaking point? Because that's the question that arrest was meant to ask. What is your breaking point? What will be too much for you? Will being served scare you enough with a lawsuit that you'll stop protesting? The FBI agents show up at your door, start knocking, and give you a subpoena to a secretive grand jury across the country. Will that be enough to distract and to dissuade you from speaking out about what you believe in? What about if the FBI knocks on your grandparents' door and tells them, do you know your grandson's a terrorist? Because they want to answer this question right now. Josh and I are co-defendants in this ridiculous Kafkaesque trial. We're the guinea pigs in their little experiment. Robert F. Kennedy, when I was growing up, was my political hero. And he once said, and this quote has always stuck with me in times of great disillusionment and isolation. He said, few are willing to brave the disapproval of their fellows, the censure of their colleagues, the wrath of society. Moral courage is a rarer commodity than bravery in battle or great intelligence. Yet it is the one essential, vital quality for those who seek to change a world that yields most painfully to change. Proudly, I get to admit, Josh and I possess that quality through the 3.5 years we campaigned to shut down one of the world's worst animal testing labs. It was precisely this quality that the government seeks and wishes to distinguish within us right now, and vis-a-vis our example and all of you. So we acquiesce to their power. We conform to the prescribed forms of social change that we're supposed to do. Just hold your signs and be polite. Have a nice potluck. Sign that petition. And please, God, please, be patriotic. Go shopping. That's where change will come from. And really, did we honestly think that our efforts at social change wasn't going to ruffle any feathers? For me, I always think of it this way. I studied political science in college. I romanticized it. It was sexy. Perhaps I'd seen Braveheart too many times to believe that social agitation, for matters of life or death, no less, would be romantic. That our selfless charge, and sadly sometimes our fall, would be set to some gorgeous musical score. That everything would happen in slow motion. And that at the end of our cause, we could get up and go back to our normal lives. It does not work like this. And any honest history textbook, and any honest account of social change history tells this story. The bullets that felled Martin Luther King tell this story. The bullets that felled Medgar Evers, my hero Robert F. Kennedy, tell this story. The lives ruined by McCarthy's House Un-American Activities Committee tell this story. J. Edgar Hoover's perverse vendetta against dissidents and anti-war organizers in the 60s tell this very story. That progressive social change is riddled with numerous accounts of state-sponsored harassment, theft, sabotage, and even murder is not some well-protected secret. It's a commonly ignored fact that people like Josh and I were all too ready to get up for the fight. A commonly ignored fact that biased media, including Fox News, all too willing to justify our beatings and our persecution. And it was stupid of us. Such universally supported concepts and institutions such as civil rights, women's suffrage, fair labor, the freedom of religious choice, and a host of other democratic reforms did not come without a fight and did not come without a sacrifice. We're a couple silly hearted liberals like Josh and I to believe that the cause we champion, one so pushed to the periphery of liberal and progressive causes, that of animal rights, would be easy, would be different from the rest of those. We're not going to get our hands dirty. That's not how social change works. We're naive. I think that is our greatest crime. Just think about it. To me, and you can disagree with me and we can debate about this, but animal exploitation is the most socially ingrained prejudice on the face of the earth. Every year, a number incomprehensible to me, billions, just every year, billions are murdered for our use and our consumption. Entire industries, economies, religions, and cultures depend upon this. Our palate is trained to crave their flesh. Our fashion dictates we wear their skin. For entertainment, we take great joy in entertainment, watching these once proud animals stripped of their dignity and forced to jump through hoops of fire to ride toy bicycles in circuses. It is a form of oppression, in my humble opinion, unlike any other in history, both in magnitude and in violence. The publicly charged accusations that grip Josh and I today, and really anybody that dares speak up and says, I support animal rights and I'm going to fight for it, just as I would fight for it if it was a human in a lab, a human being killed, is that we are extremists, that we are terrorists. Think about it. The U.S. populace in this country has seldom shied away from supporting acts of sabotage, liberation, armed conflicts, assassinations, terrorism, and even wars. Now, newsflash here, brace yourselves. The United States of America is hardly some touchy-feely Buddhist superpower. Everybody in this country supports, and I would hope you support, acts of sabotage and liberation and vandalism and even violence. We supported it in the concentration camps. We supported Nelson Mandela and his fight against the apartheid government. It was an act of economic sabotage when a bunch of 18th century treasonists drank some tea at the Boston Harper that ignited a revolution in this country for freedom. But in our circumstance, we support it for non-human animals. We support it for animals. And when we restrict the terms and the tactics of what we can do on behalf of animals, when Josh and I get charged with terrorism for simply standing at podiums like this and saying hurrah to people that break into labs and take dogs and primates out, that we should be called terrorists, is hypocrisy. And it's hypocrisy based on oppression and a prejudice and a discrimination called speciesism. Just like all the other isms. It's the belief that our human animals have supremacy over every other form of life on this earth. It's an oppression. Some people don't even believe humans are animals. This impression is the same as sexism, it's the same as racism, and it's rooted in the same tired and shallow argument that we're smarter than them. You've heard that before with myth to women. It's for their own good, as we heard with slavery, or my personal favorite, God gave us dominion. And just as men are not smarter than women, just as slavery was not the best interest of black Africans, and just as God did not give George W. Bush the moral authority over any other nation or people, animals are sentient. They're socially complex, intelligent beings whose best interests are not best served on our dinner plates, lining our coats, or wearing our eye makeup. What Josh and I and many people probably in this room have engaged in championing the cause of animal rights is a revolutionary social movement that seeks to challenge these very social constructions of dietary, cultural, economic, and industrial habits for a more compassionate and ultimately a more sustainable world. That's why these little games of protests and agitation are called struggles, because they are struggles. That when you get involved and when you sign up right now and you take a stand against sweatshops, child labor, the war in Iraq, or for animal rights, you're getting involved with something that is not a weekend hobby. Should you wish to truly think it will be successful, it's called a struggle for a reason. It takes hard work, and yes, as stupid Josh and I are learning, it takes sacrifice. Frederick Douglass said this once, and I know most of you in this room know this quote. It's one of the most famous quotes used by Martin Luther King and those in the Civil Rights Movement, that the whole history and progress of human liberty shows that all concessions yet made unto our august claims have been born of earnest struggle. If there is no struggle, there is no progress. And those who profess to favor freedom, yet deprecate agitation, are men who want crops without plowing up the land. They want the rain, the thunder, and the lightning. They want the ocean without the awful roar of its many waters. It's precisely it. I've known that quote personally since I was 11 years old. I consider myself lucky. I grew up in Minneapolis, Minnesota. And unlike some of my anarchist friends, Josh Harper, he's an anarchist, he's proud of it. I wasn't an anarchist. I grew up in a really political family. And I feel always really stupid saying this, but I believed in America. I grew up in a family where my dad was a city councilman for 8 years, a mayor for 5. I grew up working on his campaigns and going out on the political stump with him, putting up signs in neighborhoods. At our dinner table, we were fortunate enough to talk about Michael Dukakis and to talk about the death penalty. In high school, I started a social justice club. I got to travel down to Tijuana, Mexico with the group and study the NAFTA-induced border crisis. College, I started an Amnesty International chapter. I worked with Ralph Nader, his public research interest group. I believed in using the process. I believed in America. I believed in my hero Robert F. Kennedy and John F. Kennedy. And this idea that we as America's citizens have these quote-unquote inalienable rights to speech, to association, to the whole host of the Bill of Rights. And I always feel stupid saying all of that in front of people, but it's my confession, because I feel like an idiot now. I'm continuously surprised at myself and the blinders I've worn to show social change and how it really works. Despite I graduated from the University of Minnesota, and I got my degree in political science, my focus was on studying revolutionary social change and how it comes about. When I'd sit in those courses, it was so sexy to me to read Nelson Mandela's biography. It was a page turn. I couldn't put it down. As soon as I finished it, I started it over and I read it again. I was hooked on this. Intoxicated me. standing at a protest with a sign. I was surprised. This isn't the America I know. This isn't supposed to happen. We're gonna fight this. We'll show the man. We're supposed to win. I was surprised. I was surprised the second time I go serve for a lawsuit. The third time, the fourth, the fifth, the sixth, the seventh, and I think today I've been a party to over 25 lawsuits in the last 3.5 years. And I'm surprised not because I'm just ridiculously dumb, but because the merit of such litigation grows more obscene and perverse with each passing lawsuit. So much so that the last two things I was served with relate to a protest in a city I've never been to in my entire life, and were staged against people and companies I've never, in my life, had the dishonor of contacting in any way, shape, or form. Yet because I stepped to podiums like this, I'm responsible. I was surprised while living in England. I was over there working on the Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty campaign. That one Saturday afternoon, sitting in a pub with some friends, enjoying a pint, that out of nowhere, a bunch of men would pick me up out of my seat and rush me out of the front door and throw me into a car, unmarked, not saying a word until I arrived at a local police station. I was put into a cell. 8 hours later, in the middle of the night, 2 immigration officers came in, presented me with the evidence of my egregious offense in that great country. I was in violation of the Immigration Act of 1972. And for those of you that don't know British immigration law, it means I was working without a visa. In my case, patently untrue. Never had a job there. But they showed me the evidence of my crime. It was voluntary work. And in my case, that counted. They had a picture of me behind a table no different than this, leaning over it, handing out a vegetarian leaflet to somebody. They also had a photograph of me on a protest march with a bullhorn. And then, God forbid, what was I thinking? There's freedom of speech in Western countries. I was quoted in the Financial Times speaking out against animal testing. And for these great, egregious crimes, the UK government deemed me too much of a threat to be in their country. I spent 5 days in the Heathrow Immigration Detention Center, where I was literally the only person in there that spoke English as my native language, which made it really hard for me to communicate with my poor cellmates. And after 5 days, now bear in mind, this is December of 2001, they led me onto a fully boarded British Airways flight to JFK in shackles to my seat. All these poor people on the plane must have thought, dear God, not again, September 11th. To humiliate me and to send home this message that animal rights is beginning to get too much of a pest for us. Some of our friends in the pharmaceutical industry are complaining too loudly. I was surprised. I was surprised again in the United States of America. On my college campus over in the University of Minnesota, I had a political science internship, as was required your senior year with a political science degree, that you have an internship in a political organization, be it with the senator, be it with ACORN, be it with a nonprofit organization, studying animal rights and revolutionary social change. My internship was with the North American Animal Liberation Front press office. The Animal Liberation Front is an underground kind of movement, underground railroad for animals. They break into labs and take animals out. The organization I interned was an incorporated organization, had a bank account, was fully legal. Its sole purpose was to study what would happen and then, when appropriate, make ourselves available to the press to explain why, in this circumstance, animal rights activists felt they had to break the law and how it is similar to other social justice movements like the Underground Railroad or the Boston Tea Party or the AIDS. Every week with my internship, believing in America at the time, mind you, I would report to my academic advisor, give written reports of what I was doing, studying the media, how to write press releases, strategies, concepts, justifications. when the Animal Liberation Front visited my campus while I was a student there, and simply took 116 animals from 2 psychology labs. Being a student there, being an intern in this press office, we thought it was only appropriate that for the first time I talked to the local press about why the ALF would do this, and why as a student on this campus, I would think it's fantastic. I did that. And overnight I became a poster boy for domestic terrorism in the state of Minnesota. So much so that one Minnesota State Republican senator passed a law, that has yet to be challenged, but it is so constitutionally flawed, that made it illegal to speak out on behalf of any illegal activity. He even tried to make the law retroactive so he could punish myself. Myself and another person are actually named in the law books in the state of Minnesota with regards to this law. I was really surprised a month later, in the midst of finals in my senior year, mind you, that 9 FBI agents kicked down the door to my apartment and took everything in there. My computer, my homework, clothing, books, paintings off the wall. I was surprised mainly because it didn't seem like this was an investigation of a crime, but more that it was harassment. I'll tell you why. I wasn't there, but my roommate was, my then girlfriend. And she was in her pajamas, which consisted really of just a t-shirt and her underwear. 9 FBI agents came in with flak jackets and automatic weapons. They wouldn't let her get dressed. They made her sit in a corner in a chair, in her underwear. One agent found a box of her journals, her personal diaries, dating back a decade. Brought them out, sat down right in front of her, and proceeded to read them and look up at her occasionally and smile. This wasn't the America that my dad told me about, the one that I romanticized in my political science education, the one that I would defend in debates with people like Josh. I was sick of it. I was an idiot. Josh and I right now are being charged with a couple of crimes. We're being charged with violations of a law from 1992, never before tried in this country. People have pled guilty to it, not taken it to trial, called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act. It's a law worded so ambiguously that it simply states, if you cross state lines and simply disrupt an animal enterprise, and by that they mean a fur farm, like Peter Young did, or a vivisection lab, or a circus, or a rodeo, or a store that sells fur coats, you're liable to be convicted of a federal offense. It's constitutionally flawed because they're criminalizing your motivation and your politics and not your actions. Example, you're in Madison, you travel to Chicago, you participate in an anti-war demonstration, you and 500 people sit in the middle of the street. You're going to get arrested. You're going to get charged with disorderly conduct, obstruction of justice, trespass, and a host of other things that are misdemeanor charges. 6 months possible, most likely a fine, nothing really. So you travel from Madison, Wisconsin, and you go to Chicago, you and a couple of friends do a lockdown, or you chain yourselves to a fur store for the afternoon, and you get arrested. You just committed a federal offense in this country. It was called the Animal Enterprise Protection Act in 1992 when a host of industries like the fur industry, the milk and dairy, or the meat and dairy, the pharmaceutical industry essentially lined the pockets of a number of congressmen and senators to put this law on the books. In 2002, 1 year past 9/11, they amended the law so it is now called the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act, so that Josh and I are now being tried with terrorism in this great country. We're also being charged with conspiracy to cause a violation of the Federal Indecency Communications Act. Does it sound like peddling porn over the internet or something? It's very seedy. They're charging us because their evidence in this case is that we cheered and said hurrah people that, brace yourselves everybody, terrorism here, I'm about to tell you what it is, sent black faxes to big corporations that sponsored animal testing. They burned out their toner ink. And then myself and 2 other roommates have 5 counts each of interstate stalking. Now Josh, as I'll tell you, he and I and none of our co-defendants in what has been called the SHAC 7 case are actually being tried or accused of going anywhere, taking anything, breaking anything, or actually physically doing anything at all. We are being tried because, God forbid, we have a website, an animal rights website that reported on protest activity across the country, that listed when demonstrations were going to happen, and after the fact sometimes said, hurrah, we're editorializing. No different than what Fox News does when George Bush breaks the law. We're being charged because of our speech, and because the internet doesn't respect state boundaries. It crosses state lines, thereby making it a federal offense. We're committing federal terrorism. And for our crimes, right now, before you, in February, I will sit in a Trent, New Jersey courtroom for a trial that will last 3 months, and I face 23 years in jail for having a website. The evidence in the case is simply this. They have a bunch of videotapes, such as these 2 going on right here, of Josh and I standing at podiums no different than this, saying words no different than this. They have printouts, literally hundreds of thousands of pages of printouts from every day that our website was on the internet. And in the year 2003, myself and my 2 roommates in our house in New Jersey were the FBI's #1 domestic terrorism investigation. They have over 600 tapes of intercepted phone calls from listening to 2 lines of phones at my home. They had 6 months of intercepting every email I received and I sent. They got a warrant to monitor in lifetime every website that we would look at in our home, every instant messenger conversation we would have. And why? Where there's smoke, there's fire, right? Josh and I had to do something, right? The government's not saying that, and we're not admitted to it, because literally we didn't do anything but launch the most well-publicized animal rights campaign. The government's charges against us is that we are involved in a conspiracy. And if you know anything about criminal law, you know conspiracies are when, like Jeremy and I here would get together outside, whisper to each other, let's break the law, let's do this, let's really get those animals. According to the government, our conspiracy takes place in every speech we say, in every email we send saying there's a protest this Friday. You live in Pennsylvania, travel into New Jersey, come to it. They're going to disrupt that lab, by going to a protest. And by having a website that would dare support people, that would do these protests, and some people that, God forbid, would break the law, break into this lab we were protesting and take dogs out. That is the criminal case. And that is it. Josh and I struck a nerve with this SHAC campaign, though. We had a campaign against a lab called Huntington Life Sciences. It's got a lab over in England and one here in New Jersey, and it's literally one of the most famous in the world. Excuse me. Because it's one of the biggest and it's one of the most notorious. 5 times people have gone into this lab wearing hidden cameras in their glasses, in their lapels, with secret cameras. They'd take pictures, and on 5 separate occasions, they would document workers in these labs punching little 4-month-old beagle puppies in the face, slamming them into walls, dissecting primates, not only while they're still alive, but still semi-conscious. And all for the great scientific advancements of caramel food coloring, tanning lotions, Procter & Gamble toothpastes, and a host of other followed the model set by Nelson Mandela, the African National Congress, in their fight against the apartheid government. Just as they targeted banks that supported the apartheid government across the world, we said, why stand outside this lab where there's 1,200 employees, holding up signs to these employees as they drive out, brandishing bloody pictures of the same thing they just did inside, hoping that this somehow changes their minds? Why do this? It's not going to work. It's just an exercise to make our own conscience feel better. So instead, this SHAC campaign, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, which exists in 18 different countries, pioneered the strategy of, instead of standing outside the lab, let's take these same signs, let's take the same anger, the same passion, and let's start standing outside of companies that this animal testing lab desperately needs to survive, but are companies that certainly don't need Huntington Life Sciences. And one by one, the world's largest investors, from Citibank, Charles Schwab, E-Trade, HSBC, dropped their millions of shares in the lab, crashing the share price. Banks pulled their accounts. Insurance services pulled their services and their accounts. Janitors wouldn't come in anymore. Food suppliers wouldn't stock the cafeteria. One by one, over 250 companies abandoned their services to the lab, bringing it to the brink of foreclosure over and over again, where it only survived because the UK government intervened on 3 separate occasions and kept it open, condemning the 500 animals that die in there every single day. This campaign was radical, not just in this tactical approach, in that people recognize there's a certain degree of speciesism, whereas if I would recognize if that was my brother or my mother inside of Huntington Life Sciences, they're taking my mom, they're shoving a tube down her trachea and into her stomach and pouring detergent into her until she would vomit and die. Would I simply be satisfied holding my sign? It was a campaign that didn't stop with the sign holding. It was a campaign where people recognized we just don't stand outside these large institutional shareholders with their signs looking up at these glass towers. Because these glass towers and these well-marketed, company-tested logos don't choose to sponsor animal testing. Individuals do. So the signs started going into the buildings. They started going into the boardrooms, locking themselves in there. The phones would ring off the hook. The email systems would be flooded. Wire faxes would be coming through. Terrorism. And at the end of the day, the executives, the CEOs, and the presidents of these companies, as they went home in their Beamers to enjoy their McMansions, their tennis courts, and their pools, saw a few of us walking through the neighborhoods, talking to the neighbors saying, got a dog and a cat? This person next door, you know how they make their living? Sponsoring studies on animals no different than your own, where they're literally tortured for about 8 months and then butchered. It struck a nerve. And for those people politically connected and politically astute in this country, you know there's few industries as powerful as the pharmaceutical industry in this country. The pharmaceutical industry is Huntington Life Sciences' bread and butter. And companies like GlaxoSmithKline and the lovely Merck with their Vioxx, and Johnson & Johnson, and Bristol-Myers Squibb recognized if this band of unpaid, grassroots, unskilled, untrained people with their signs can bring the world's biggest animal, one of the world's biggest animal testing labs to its knees, what makes us think that they're not going to come after us and do the same exact damn thing? And this industry went to their political overlords, and they've done their bidding. In the United States of America, since the year 2000, over $200 million has been spent by the pharmaceutical industry on federal election lobbying. Our Senate Majority Leader, Bill Frist, took $200,000, the max, in his last campaign. There are over 1,200 pharmaceutical lobbyists in Washington, D.C. alone, more so than any other industry. In the United Kingdom, literally, the animal rights movement and this little grassroots SHAC campaign, Stop Huntington Animal Cruelty, is such a threat to their whole economy that the CEO of both GlaxoSmithKline and AstraZeneca met with Prime Minister Tony Blair and threatened him. If something isn't done about this animal rights SHAC threat, we promise you we will not invest $1 more in your country in research. It's the second largest industry in your country. We're debating in the House of Parliament, and just 2 weeks ago, we debated in the U.S. Senate hearing focused on the SHAC campaign. It's scary times we live in right now. There's such power in this industry. Huntington Life Sciences is just but one company, but it's come to symbolize so much more. That a line has been drawn in the sand. On one side there's animal rights, on the other side there's animal research, and it is widely considered that this battleground is Huntington Life Sciences, and it is a winner-take-all battle. And they're not going to go down without a fight. But the fight is what we need right now, more than ever in this country. My indictment is the wake-up call to you. You can either look at it as the wake-up call, or you can look at it as the government wants you to see it. Your reason to shut the fuck up. Because you don't want to go through this. But should you be brave enough right now to stand up against the war in Iraq, against child labor, against big oil, against animal testing, or whatever your cause is, you stand proudly with other great bastions of hope in this country. The Cesar Chavez, the Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the Harriet Tubmans, the Nelson Mandelas, Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, who all risked their life and their liberty to say what they believe in. I'll end with a quote on a story. I think it's more of a poem, maybe a quote, that most of you already know. It's from somebody during Nazi Germany. And he said, when everything was going to hell, and the ghettos were forming, the Holocaust was happening. First they came for the Jews, and I said nothing. Then they came for the trade unionists, and I said nothing. And then the gypsies, and I said nothing. And so on. When they finally came for me, there was nobody left to say anything. Right now they're coming for the animal rights people. They're coming for Josh and I. And this February, when I sit in a courtroom in Trenton, New Jersey, I hope to God you say something. Thank you for having me.
Forgive me tonight if I seem a little bit distracted. I have a hell of a toothache right now, but I figure if I'm tough enough to face down the FBI, I'm tough enough to get through this. Let's see how I do. Anyway, I want to echo a little bit of what Kevin and Jeremy had to say earlier about thanking the sponsors here tonight. As you know, this tour is called Ban This, and ironically enough, our speaking date a few days ago, which was scheduled to be at St. Thomas University, was in fact banned. 3 days before we were supposed to speak due to concerns about eco-terrorism. Anyway, I come before you tonight, and as you've heard, I am an accused terrorist. So how did this happen? Actually, I got a phone call shortly after me and Kevin's indictment from my grandmother. And she's on the other line, and I answered, and she said, "Josh, when did you become a terrorist?" I think it happened one day back when I was about 14 years old. It was before I was ever a vegetarian, before I was a vegan, before I'd read a single book about animal rights, before I'd been indoctrinated into any sort of protest culture. I was out for a walk one day with a wonderful dog who I lived with, whose name was Max. I had been living with Max since I was about 11 years old, and to this day, he remains the dearest being that I have ever known. I was closer to him than actually I think I was closer to him than even my mother or my sister. Anyway, Max and I were walking past my neighbor's house, and I lived next door to this guy who was in his mid-30s, kind of angry at the world because things hadn't turned out the way he wanted them to be, super anal retentive. This guy measured his lawn. You'd see him out there every weekend before he mowed with a ruler, I'm not kidding. And anyway, as I was walking Max past his house, Max did what dogs do and began to urinate on the guy's lawn. So he saw this through his window and he came running outside, angered beyond belief that this dog could pee on his lawn, and he began screaming at me. And I said, relax, it's not going to stain, he's just peeing. And the guy didn't accept that. And he ran up and he kicked Max in the side as hard as he could. Now keep in mind, this was before I'd ever heard of Gandhian nonviolence or token of suffering or anything like that. And so I did what came to me most intuitively. I did the most appropriate thing that I could think of to do at that moment. And I pulled back my skinny 14-year-old arm and I knocked that motherfucker out. That was the most violent thing, however, that I've ever done for animal rights. And I stand here before you today as an accused terrorist, not because I hit anyone or even put anyone in fear of being hit, but because I appeared at a school much like this one, the University of Washington, and I spoke to a group of students, much like y'all, and I talked about taking 3 sheets of black paper and taping them end to end to end, putting one into a fax machine, dialing the number of a financial institution, and once the first sheet of paper went through, and keep in mind right now, I am repeating an act of terrorism by telling you this. I talked about waiting for the first sheet to finish feeding through the fax machine and then taping the last sheet to the top, so it runs in a continuous loop. Osama bin Laden, move over. Josh Harper's in town and he's after your fax paper and your toner. It's ludicrous. It's ludicrous. And there's days where I feel like it's absolutely laughable. And then there's other days where it makes me cry. Because to come up with these charges, to tape me, they had undercover FBI agents in the audience. In fact, there were more law enforcement in the audience than there were actual students there to hear my speech. To obtain all this evidence of this, horrible crime against me, for which I'm facing 3 years in federal prison, the FBI had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars paying off one of my best friends to follow me and spy on me, report back on my activities for a period of 3 years. They had gone through my garbage. They had tapped my phone. They had tapped my email. They had paid my mailman to write down the return addresses of everything sent to my home and to write down the license plate numbers of anyone who had parked outside. They had sent the FBI, the BATF, Secret Service, state police, and local police as part of a joint terrorism task force into my home to tear apart my belongings and to take evidence of horrible crimes. And this evidence consisted of things like Taekwondo medals from when I was 11 years old. They took pictures of my sister when she was 3. Important things like one of my roommate's bras, which I guess could have contributed to an arson, or I don't know. Anyway, I had been put through an awful lot just so they could tape this speech of me talking to a group of students about sending black sheets of paper through a fax machine, which of course uses a telephone line, which of course is an interstate facility, and of course it was meant to disrupt an animal enterprise, so they claim. And so I broke in, according to them, the Animal Enterprise Terrorism Act. As I said earlier, sometimes this seems laughable, but right now it frightens the hell out of me. A lot of people here have heard a course about a little thing back in 1971 called Watergate. What a lot of people don't know is during the Watergate investigation, several FBI agents who had helped Nixon carry out his campaign of spying against the Democratic Party, they were afraid of being further prosecuted. So they cut a deal with federal prosecutors, and they brought forward documents showing that the FBI had been engaged in a campaign of extra-legal terrorism against U.S. citizens. And this campaign was called the Counterintelligence Program, or COINTELPRO. One of the first things that COINTELPRO was charged with doing was disrupting, discrediting, and otherwise neutralizing what the FBI referred to as black nationalist hate groups. Who were these black nationalist hate groups? It was the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In other words, the groups most closely aligned with Martin Luther King. The FBI, in its quest to neutralize these groups, had broken into people's homes, had terrorized their families, had visited their workplaces and had them fired, and in some cases had even hired right-wing students on campuses to start fistfights with members of these organizations. So of course, when this information came out, the American public was angered, greatly angered by what they heard. And so the director of the FBI got on national television, and he promised that this will never happen again. Shortly after, Congress passed a law known as the Freedom of Information Act. And one of the things that they said that the Freedom of Information Act would do was to provide some transparency as it relates to the Federal Bureau of Investigations, so that people like you and I would no longer be abused by their conservative, almost corporate culture. Of course, they were lying. And throughout the 1970s, COINTELPRO continued against groups such as the Black Panther Party, the American Indian Movement, the Puerto Rican Liberation Movement, and so on, and so on, and so on. Actually, parts of the Midwest against the American Indian Movement, and in the end, the death toll there was well above a dozen. And again, documentation of this came out in 1981, and again, the FBI hit the airwaves saying that this would never happen again, and again, they were lying. Throughout the 1980s, the United States government tapped more than 5,000 people's phones, including 2 U.S. senators and 1 U.S. representative, because they were part of a movement known as the Committee in Solidarity with the People of El Salvador. The U.S. government hired, which, by the way, was a group largely based in the Christian church here in the United States. And one of the things that the FBI did during this time was they hired a man named Frank Varelli in Dallas, and he was hired to break the Dallas chapter of CISPES. And again, he hired right-wing students to start fights and rallies. He broke into people's homes. He planted evidence. He produced leaflets and pamphlets with the CISPES name on them that, misrepresented their political work, that tried to put them in the light of being a violent organization. And most despicably, Frank Varelli tried to seduce activist nuns to obtain blackmail photos. This campaign of intimidation and harassment has continued. And today, people like Kevin and myself and our 4 co-defendants are its current victims. What's the relation here? How am I drawing point A to point B? Keep in mind that back in the 1970s, during the height of COINTELPRO, the director of the FBI at the time, Mr. Hoover, called the Black Panther Party the greatest threat to the internal security of the United States of America. Just a few months ago, the FBI's top agent in charge of domestic counterterrorism referred to Stop Huntington animal cruelty as U.S. #1 domestic terrorist threat. We need to stop this now. We need to stop this at the point where it's just bogus charges. We need to prevent this from getting so much worse. On February 6th, me and my friends are going to court in Trenton, New Jersey. And Kevin here, who spoke to you earlier, is facing 23 years in federal prison for pure speech activity. Not a single one of my co-defendants has been accused of a physical act. And yet, we're looking at spending, in some cases, decades behind bars. We can't allow this to happen. We cannot allow this to become another dark period in U.S. history where all dissenting views are crushed and where only one dominant view is allowed to reach people via the media, via websites, via newsletters, via all the other methods that we voiced our opinions about the necessity for sabotage and other acts of civil disobedience in the animal rights movement. I don't care today if you're an animal rights activist, or if you're a hunter, or if you're just an everyday Joe and you don't like the tactics that we were talking about. The fact of the matter is, at the end of the day, you have to recognize our First Amendment rights to say those things. We cannot give the United States government a loophole to bypass the First Amendment by saying that by speaking about things, by talking about things, we were conspiring to make them occur. On February 6th, when we stand trial, we need all of you to stand behind us. For some of you, that will mean donating to our legal defense, which you can do online at www.shac7.com. Or is it .net?
Oh, it's
.com, sorry. And for others, I hope it means making that long drive to New Jersey to stand with dozens and hopefully even hundreds of other people as we go on trial for pure speech activity. I'm going to leave you today with one other quick story. At the beginning of this campaign, what drove me to become involved, what drove me to say the things that I did, what drove me to travel to Little Rock, Arkansas, what drove me to then move back to Seattle, Washington, and continue pushing this campaign, even though in Little Rock I had been run off the road by thugs who I believe were hired by a man named Warren Stevens, even though the sheriff of Little Rock showed up at my front door and told me when I opened it, he said, "I'm going to run you out of town," which, by the way, was pretty awkward. What's the etiquette there? You know, oh, you want some tea? Anyway, what drove me to do all of this was one of the very things that the government is trying to stop. I had visited a website, and on that website I had seen video footage of a grown man in a doctor's smock holding up a 4-month-old beagle puppy by the scruff of his neck and punching him repeatedly in the face. The government should not be allowed to stop that spark of anger that keeps people like you and me from rising up against such horrible acts. The government should not be allowed to prevent us from expressing our heartfelt views and from even pushing as hard as we can to keep things like that from happening again. I hope all of you here today, no matter what your issues, no matter what...
Get involved with them and help lead the charge in organizing support, going out there. There's a SHAC USA website at shacamerica.com.net and .org. You can get on an email action alert list, log on to see what other people are doing across the country, and just participate. Ultimately, that's my goal. I guess sitting in jail will be a lot easier if it happens, knowing that that miserable lab has been shut down and it was all worth it. But
you had mentioned that no one has been brought to trial under this Animal Enterprise Act.
nobody's ever taken it to trial.
Right, but you did mention that some people had pled.
2 people.
Yeah, okay. What were they charged with and what kind of sentences did they get?
Both of them were here in Madison. A number of years ago, I believe it was in 1997, 2 men from the state of Washington were charged with violation of the Animal Enterprise Protection Act because they traveled from Iowa to Wisconsin and maybe another state, and they went onto fur farms and opened cages for mink, and they ran out. One of them was caught in Holland in 1999, brought here. He pled guilty to the charge and was given a 2-year sentence. The other gentleman, Peter Young, was caught just this last year and was brought to court here in Madison this summer. He took a deal, pled guilty to Animal Enterprise Protection Act, and was also given 2 years. Originally, they were facing 83 because their government was trying to charge them with racketeering, violations of the RICO Act that's used against the mob.
Right.
Yeah, but fortunately, in February 2003, the Supreme Court, in a case called Schneider versus Now, found that political activists, thank God, cannot be charged with extortion because we have nothing tangible to gain from our protest activity. We do it selflessly, and coercion is really like,
What was your substantive act? I mean, what are they saying you actually did? Does that involve this black sheets through the bags?
In my case, it involves the speech where I advocated, or I talked about the historical use anyway, of sending black sheets of paper to financial
You
institutions.
didn't actually do it. You just
they're not
No.
saying we did any of it,
No.
but we talk about it, we report on it, and in some cases, we cheer it on.
Okay.
And that's the substantive act is our speech.
Wow, is this the same kind of stuff they use on Aldo Rama? With the World Trade Center. That he had somehow
I don't know.
convinced people to do something, even though it was just talk.
I don't know his case. Is that Lynn Stewart's case? Is that what she got in trouble for? Well, thank you for. Oh, go ahead.
I have another question, because I'm trying to understand. Huntington's like a private thing; they're not government funded at all. So why is there a connection between them and the FBI?
Let me take part of this. People often ask why just real quick to give you a little bit of background here. During the year of 2002 and 2003, the FBI granted more wiretap requests to the FBI to monitor animal rights activists than they did to monitor Muslim extremists. The government has spent millions of dollars already to prosecute us on this case. And so why would they do such a thing if they were only concerned about people sending black sheets of paper through fax machines?
What was driving that concern?
Well, the reason is that, for one thing, in England, the pharmaceutical industry has promised to rock Britain's economy if this campaign wins. One of their largest biomedical associations over there has threatened to pull billions of dollars out of Britain's economy. And of course, that's not something that the government wants to deal with. Here in the United States, the pharmaceutical industry is the largest lobbying group. And so they have millions and millions of dollars invested in Washington, D.C., just to convince politicians to pass laws to shut down organizations and activists like me and Kevin. That's what's pushing this, is the corporate demand to see results. The people who we've come up against in this campaign, and keep in mind, I'm from small towns in Oregon, I grew up dirt poor. These multi-billion-dollar industries don't like to see people like myself and like you all having an impact on their profits. And that's what's happened during the course of this campaign. We've gone up against multi-billionaires, people like Warren Stevens. We've gone up against the world's largest insurance brokerage. And of course, these are well-connected, very powerful people. And now their powerful friends in Washington, D.C. are making sure that we're punished for daring to stand up to these interests.
Yeah, it is their private police. Yeah.
What is your defense strategy? Are you challenging the constitutionality of the law, or are you just going to plead not guilty?
It's a straight-up constitutional challenge.
So you're going to basically plead guilty?
Guess what? There is a website. There is things said on it. I speak at podiums. Yes, I did all of these things, but guess what? So what? The First Amendment to the Bill of Rights protects my right to do these things. And we believe that this law is constitutionally challenged. And ultimately, with our stalking charges, the government has to prove that Jake and Lauren and I, allegedly behind a website, which they have to prove that too, put people in other states that we have never met, talked to, even seen pictures of, in reasonable fear for their life via a website. We're going to plead not guilty. We didn't put anybody in fear of their life. We are a nonviolent movement. In the 30 years the animal rights movement has been in the United States of America, not one person has ever been hurt by an animal rights activist. Even in the illegal things, animal liberation front, breaking into things, taking dogs out, even more controversially, burning labs down, they take the most precautions you can take to make sure nobody ever gets hurt. Nobody could ever think that our protests were motivated by a desire to kill them. And that's what stalking means. I don't think they'll prevail on any of these charges. Ultimately, I think these charges aren't meant to put us in jail, hopefully, fingers crossed. They're meant to drag us through the coals.
To bleed you?
To bleed us, to punish us, and have all of you watch the spectacle so you know better in the future.
Well, I know we're violent terrorists and everything, but we're real nice guys. So if you want to come up and talk to us afterwards and ask more